Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to rise today on behalf of the NDP to support Bill C66 and its quick passage into law. For me, as a member of the LGBTQ2 community, the government's apology last week was a long-awaited, historic moment that paves the way for a more just and a more inclusive Canada for everyone. I feel like I'm walking in the path walked by so many brave and tireless activists throughout the last 50 years. And I also want to acknowledge the important work of former New Democrat MPs like Svend Robinson, Libby Davies, Bill C66, and Greg Scott, who paved the way for gay and lesbian Canadians in this House. I'd like to pay particular tribute to the work of my colleague, the member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke, whose tireless efforts resulted in transgendered and gender non-binary finally receiving the same protection as rights as all other Canadians. Last week's apology from the Prime Minister on behalf of the Government of Canada was a very emotional day for many Canadians, as well for me, Mr. Speaker. Even as we celebrated the moment and looked forward to the righting of past injustices, the day also inevitably revived some darker memories of what Canadians have suffered. In 1965, Everett Clippard from Saskatchewan became the last Canadian to be in jail because he was gay. He was declared a dangerous sexual offender and was sentenced to life in prison in 1966. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld his conviction until he was released in 1971, 2 years after then Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau's bill legalized consensual homosexual acts. Journalist John Ibbotson, who profiled Clippard, recently said in an interview, and I quote, "He didn't see himself as a pioneer in gay rights movement. He was just a guy who loved driving trucks and, as it turned out, loved men as well." Everett was merely the last Canadian to have been in prison for whom he loved. There are countless Canadians whose lives have been shattered and altered immeasurably because they were persecuted for who they are. And while the apology is welcomed and the right thing to do, there are many for whom it has come too late. It came too late for Everett Clippard. Every change, every advancement in law, every protection of basic human rights enshrined into law and policy for members of the LGBTQ2 community has been achieved by dragging governments and public institutions kicking and screaming to do the right thing. Let us hope those days are over and that today is the day we commit as a Parliament to end all state-sanctioned discrimination and begin the long overdue restoration of justice to its victims. Let us hope that indeed, as the headline for former NDP MP Svend Robinson's opinion piece in the Globe and Mail states, and I quote, "For the countless Canadians humiliated by anti-gay policies, healing can finally begin." Thanks to activists and allies here in Canada, we have seen a gradual shift away from persecution and unjust punishment and a slow but unstoppable recognition of rights for LGBTQ2 people. And I wanted to share a brief timeline. In 1969, homosexuality ceased to be a crime in Canada, but it still took 2 more years before Everett Clippard was released from jail. In 1975, Doug Wilson, a graduate student in the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan, was refused by the Dean of College of Education to supervise practice teachers in the school system because he was a gay activist. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission dismissed his case of discrimination. In December 1977, Quebec included sexual orientation in its Human Rights Code, making it the first province in Canada to pass a gay civil rights law. By 2001, all provinces and territories had taken this step forward. In 1978, Canada's new Immigration Act removed homosexuals from the list of inadmissible classes. In 1979, the Canadian Human Rights Commission recommends in its annual report that sexual orientation be added to the Canadian Human Rights Act. The following year, MP Pat Carney tabled the Bill C242, which would prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. It doesn't pass. And NDP MP Svend Robinson introduces similar bills in 1983, in 1985, in 1986, in 1989, and 1991. In 1991, Robinson tried to get the definition of spouse in the Income Tax Act and the Canada Pension Act to include or of the same sex. In 1992, he tried to get the word opposite sex definition of spouse removed from Bill C66, which would add the definition to survivor benefit provisions of federal pension legislation. All the proposed bills were defeated. In 1987, Don Cochrane, a professor of education at the University of Saskatchewan, organizes the first Breaking the Silence conference to discuss gay and lesbian issues in the education system. That year, the conference actually celebrated its 30th year this year, but that year, the organizers had to hire security to protect attendees from physical and verbal harassment and abuse from protesters. In 1988, Svend Robinson becomes the first member of Parliament to come out. Robinson was first elected to the House of Commons in 1979, and in 2000, the BC riding of Burnaby Douglas, as it was called then, elected him for the 8th time. Mr. Speaker, in 1991, Delvin Ferrand, a lab instructor at Kingston University College in Edmonton, Alberta, is fired from his job because he is gay. The Alberta Human Rights Commission refuses to investigate the case because the Alberta Individual Rights Protection Act does not cover discrimination based on sexual orientation. 7 years later, after being fired for being gay, the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and finally, on April 2, 1998, the High Court unanimously rules that the exclusion of homosexuals from Alberta's Individual Rights Protection Act is a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Also that year, in my community, Gay and Lesbian Health Services in Saskatoon, now called out Saskatoon, opened its doors, thanks to the sheer determination and tenacity of Jens Helquist. GLHS was started to serve the underserved health, social, and emotional needs of gays and lesbians in Saskatchewan. In August 1992, in Hague-Birch versus Canada, the Ontario Court of Appeal rules that the failure to include sexual orientation in the Canadian Human Rights Act is discriminatory. Federal Justice Minister Kim Campbell responds to the decision by announcing the government would take the necessary steps to include sexual orientation in the Canadian Human Rights Act. In November 1992, after a landmark legal challenge was won by Michelle Douglas, who was fired from the military for being a lesbian in 1989. The federal courts finally lifted in 1992 the country's ban on homosexuals in the military, and that year, for the first time, allowed gays and lesbians to serve with pride in the armed forces. In May 1995, the Supreme Court ruled on the case involving Jim Egan and Jack Nesbitt, two gay men who sued Ottawa for the right to claim a spousal pension under the Old Age Security Act. The court ruled against Egan and Nesbitt. However, all 9 judges agreed that sexual orientation is a protected ground. May 1995, an Ontario judge finds that the Child and Family Services Act of Ontario infringes Section 15 of the Charter by not allowing same-sex couples to bring joint application for adoption. Ontario became the first province to make it legal for same-sex couples to adopt. British Columbia, Alberta, and Nova Scotia followed quickly after. In 1996, the federal government finally passes Bill C-33 and adds sexual orientation to the Canadian Human Rights Act. In 1999 of May, the Supreme Court of Canada rules same-sex couples should have the same benefits and obligations as opposite-sex common-law couples and equal access to benefits from social programs to which they contribute. And in June of that year, although many laws will have to be revised to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling in May, Parliament votes 216 to 55 in favour of preserving the definition of marriage as a union of a man and a woman. In the year 2000, in February, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's Liberals introduced Bill C-23, the Modernization of Benefits and Obligations Act, in response to the Supreme Court's May ruling. The Act would give same-sex couples who have lived together for more than a year the same benefits and obligations as all common-law couples. On April 11, 2000, Parliament passes Bill C-23 with a vote of 174 to 72. The legislation gives same-sex couples the same social and tax benefits as all couples. In total, the bill affected over 68 federal statutes relating to a wide range of issues: pension benefits, old age security, income tax deduction, bankruptcy protection, and the criminal code. Despite this, the definitions of marriage and spouse are left untouched. On December 10th in the year 2000, Reverend Brent Hawkes of the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto reads the first banns, an old Christian tradition of publishing or giving public notice of people's intent to marry for two same-sex couples. Hawkes says that if the banns are read on 3 Sundays before the wedding, he can legally marry the couple. The two same-sex couples are married on January 14th, 2001. The following day, the Ontario government reiterates the government's position, saying the marriages will not be legally recognized. The year 2000 was also the year that in Saskatoon, Mount Royal High School teacher Patty Rowley attended a session at a school board convention by Gay and Lesbian Health Services. A year later, she started the Gay Straight Alliance in a high school in Saskatoon at Mount Royal Collegiate. She has been facilitating a weekly meeting for students and teachers ever since, 22 years later. In May of 2002, the Ontario Supreme Court Justice Robert McKinnon rules that a gay student has the right to take his boyfriend to the prom. And in July 2002, for the very first time, a Canadian court rules in favor of recognizing same-sex marriages under the law. The Ontario Superior Court rules that prohibiting gay couples from marrying is unconstitutional and violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In February of 2003, MP Svend Robinson unveils a private member's bill that would allow same-sex marriages. The federal government has already changed several laws to give same-sex couples the same benefits and obligations as heterosexual common law couples. In June of that year, the Ontario Court of Appeal upholds a lower court ruling to legally allow same-sex marriages. And I quote here from the judgment, "The existing common law definition of marriage violates the couple's equality rights on the basis of sexual orientation." In June 2003, the Ontario government announces that the province will finally obey the law and register same-sex marriages. Nearly 24 couples apply for marriage licenses in Ontario the following day. In August 2003, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien vows not to let religious objections alter his stand on same-sex marriage. He says members of Parliament will be allowed to vote freely on the bill when it's introduced into the House of Commons after his retirement in 2004. In December of 2003, the Ontario Court rules that Ottawa has discriminated against same-sex couples by denying benefit to their partners who had died before 1998, and the court rules that benefits will be retroactive to April 17, 1985, when equality rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into effect. In December 2004, the Supreme Court of Canada rules that the federal government can change the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples. In February of 2005, the federal government finally introduces its same-sex marriage bill in the House of Commons. The bill, if passed, would give married same-sex partners the same legal protection as other married couples. And in the May of that year, a Canadian Forces sergeant and a warrant officer are married in the chapel at CFB Greenwood, Nova Scotia, in the military's very first gay wedding. In June of 2005, the controversial Bill C-38, titled Law on Civil Marriage, passes final reading in the House of Commons, sailing through with a vote of 158 to 133. On July 20th, 2005, the bill becomes law, and Canada is the 4th country in the world, after the Netherlands, Belgium, and Spain, to finally and officially recognize same-sex marriage. So you can see, Mr. Speaker, the road to the apology has been strewn with obstacles and the struggle and the resistance has been real and unrelenting, and each battle has been fought multiple times in multiple jurisdictions. And while governments, parliaments, police services, and other institutions created to protect people continue to persecute and prosecute LGBTQ Canadians, brave and courageous souls made change, positive change despite governments, one person, one family, one community at a time, and they saved people's lives. And while the apology sadly came too late for some of these brave people, it does represent a much brighter future for those who remain. Mr. Speaker, the apology is the proper first step, and we applaud the government for taking it. New Democrats have been unwavering in calling for a just apology, and we are pleased that the government has announced that it is including redress measures in this bill, as an apology without any redress measures would have been just an apology, not a just apology. Mr. Speaker, there are thousands of people with unjust historic convictions for consensual same-sex sexual activity still on the records, and these convictions continue to be a barrier for people when it comes to travel, to volunteer, even to get a job. New Democrats have fought to make sure expungement legislation was tabled at the same time as the apology, and we are committed to working together with all parliamentarians and government to get this legislation passed as soon as possible. By expunging the convictions for historic consensual same-sexual activity, the government is ensuring that no unfairly applied discriminatory label or judgment can continue to have negative impacts on people's daily lives. So while this Bill C66 is not perfect, we believe that all the issues in question are fixable without amending the bill, and therefore should not cause delay in the passage of the bill. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats would like to see the immediate implementation of a process for the expungement of criminal records for consensual same-sex sexual activity. Speedy follow-through on a redress measures is necessary to complete and validate the government apology. And now that Bill C66 is tabled, we want to also make sure the government continues, make sure that Canadian Forced Service records are revised, quickly move on the tabled legislation to repeal Section 159 of the Criminal Code, and of course finally end the blood ban for men who have sex with men. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank those who went before us, as well as everyone who continues to work towards a more inclusive and equal Canada. There remains, unfortunately, lots still to do. Mr. Speaker, I chose to be a member of Parliament for Saskatoon West and to run. My goal was to end homelessness. As we heard the Parliamentary Secretary mention, LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in youth homelessness in this country. It is estimated that between 25 and 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ2. These young people are more vulnerable or at a higher risk of homelessness because of homophobia and transphobia. LGBTQ youth leave home most often because of violence and abuse. Their home is not safe for them. They often choose to live literally on the street because they face homophobia and transphobia in our shelter systems and in support services. So despite human rights legislation, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, legalizing same-sex marriage, homophobia and transphobia are still very much a part of our daily life in Canada, in our language, in our behaviour, and in the policies and practices of many of our helping institutions. In the timeline I shared today, I highlighted important Canadian firsts that took place in my home province of Saskatchewan, important milestones that have improved the lives of LGBTQ2 Canadians. I'd like to end my remarks on one final first. This fall, the first long-term LGBTQ2 youth home in Canada, Pride Home, was opened in my riding. The youth home is operated by the amazing organization Out Saskatoon. In 2016, the survey by Out Saskatoon found that 40% of the local LGBTQ2 youth had dealt with homeless at some point in their life, in their short life. Mr. Speaker, I know we all hope for the day that all LGBTQ2 youth I think we would say all youth, have a warm and supportive, loving home. But until then, thank goodness for organizations like Out Saskatoon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development and La Francophonie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her remarks. Mr. Speaker, over the last little while, subsequent to the apology, we've seen Maclean's reports with Lucy LaPearl talking about how important and poignant the apology was for her as a recognition of what she has been through and the trauma that she had over her life. In fact, she stood in the gallery, and as we watched the Prime Minister give this apology and watched Lucy in the gallery, it was really a powerful moment. Can the honourable member tell us what this apology means, not just for today, but for future generations of Canadians in this country?
Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for sharing those comments. And I think I had hoped I organized a viewing of the government's apology for young people in my riding. Of course, I was here in Ottawa and I wasn't in Saskatoon, and so I am looking forward to going home to see what their view is. They're very young. They're looking forward. Some of the things that came up during the apology, both by the government and the other parliamentary leaders, probably told them about things that they may never have known. So I think, I think an apology is an important first step. It starts a process, and I think in my comments I mentioned it's very important to move very quickly on this legislation. We don't want, and I don't think anybody in this House wants, just an apology. We want an apology that has redress. As far as it can go, no one can go back and sort of have everything restored. But it is important that we cooperate across party lines, move as many pieces of legislation forward as soon as possible, hopefully before we go home for Christmas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There will be